I'd like for us this morning, during the morning message period, to continue our study in the book of Matthew. And so if you'll open to Matthew chapter 2, that'll pretty much be almost everywhere we are this morning in the scriptures. And so I encourage you to have your Bible open and follow along with me, because really the question that is presented in this chapter, in my mind, is whether Jesus is worthy of worship or destruction, because that's how extreme the opinions, not just opinions, but actions carried out in this chapter are. And that's very unusual considering Jesus at this point in his life is a babe or infant, probably just a couple of years old. And so this is a situation in Matthew chapter 2, and let's read beginning in verse 1. Now, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, "Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the east and have come to worship him." It's kind of like happy birthday to who? Because they know somehow from their examination of the stars that someone important, they're even able to identify them as the King of the Jews, and that's why they've come to Jerusalem, the capital of the nation of the Jews, and they're wanting to see this king that they have been alerted to. And they were certainly ready to present Jesus with gifts fit for a king's palace. And so when they set off for Judea, they expected to find a nation celebrating the recent birth of a royal prince. But when they arrived, no one else seemed to be aware of the momentous event. Herod the Great, who was the ruling king mentioned here in verse 1, he wasn't even a native Jew. He was actually an Edomite. And if you know the history of this period, it's kind of a lot of political machinations. And so this Edomite himself was not born King of the Jews. He was made King of the Jews, imposed as King of the Jews by Rome. Herod's father had kind of worked through his political influence to get his son Herod a governorship in Galilee, but then after Herod's father had been assassinated, he went to Rome himself and managed to convince the folks there to give him a royal throne or kingship identified by Rome and essentially supported by Rome, imposed over the Jewish people. And so the Jews did not choose, they didn't even choose this person. They didn't elect him. He wasn't born King of the Jews. He was imposed King of the Jews. And on top of that, Herod the king had no recently born children. And he was so evil, suspicious, and jealous, he had already executed 2 of his own children who he is suspected of plotting against him. And so this gives you a kind of a picture of the character of this individual. And we're going to get a lot more ugly information about his character as this story progressed. So these strangers, men from the east, arrive in Jerusalem asking this question: where is the one who's been born King of the Jews? Verse 3, when Herod the king heard this, he was troubled. And I guess we have a pretty good understanding of why that would be. And all Jerusalem with him. And when he had gathered all the chief priests and scribes of the people together, he inquired of them where the Christ was to be born. So they said to him, in Bethlehem of Judea, for thus it is written by the prophet, but you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are not the least among the rulers of Judah, for out of you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. So when these wise men arrived asking, where is he who is born King of the Jews, there was no celebration. Instead, Herod and all Jerusalem was troubled. Now the timing prophetically was right for the arrival of the long prophesied Messiah or Christ and his everlasting kingdom to arrive according to God's revelation to Daniel the prophet. And Hosea had prophesied the location where the Christ or Messiah would to be born. And that's the prophecy that's quoted in our text. It was to be in Bethlehem in Judea. But Herod was not going to let anyone, not even the Christ, threaten his throne. And so, because of that, these same prophecies that marked Jesus as the Christ also marked him as a target, a political threat to the powerful, evil, cruel, and corrupt Herod, the so-called Great. So, verse 7, then Herod, when he had secretly called the wise men, determined from them what time the star appeared, and sent them to Bethlehem and said, go and search carefully for the young child, and when you have found him, bring back word to me that I may come and worship him also. So Herod's plot against Jesus goes into action. He calls the wise men and, pretending to share their feelings, uses their eagerness to meet the child to find out approximately how old the child must be. And he also intends to make use of their efforts to find the child. He wants to use those efforts to be able to lay hands on the child at the earliest possible moment. And so this is the plot that Herod devises to remove what he sees as a threat to his rule, even though it is just a mere infant child. Let's keep reading. Verse 9. When they heard the king, they departed, and behold, the star which they had seen in the east went before them till it came and stood over where the young child was. When they saw the star, they rejoiced with exceedingly great joy. Well, not suspecting what they've set in motion in Jerusalem, the wise men soon come to Bethlehem, which is a small village about 6 miles to the south of Jerusalem. And the star, and it's kind of difficult to imagine exactly what it must have looked like. A star that we would, as I would describe it or think of it in the sky, couldn't go ahead of people and certainly couldn't point out a particular house under normal circumstances. And so this is certainly an unusual, obviously it's supernatural, but it's even hard to imagine what this would have looked like or what's being described here. But it says, when they saw the star, they rejoiced with exceedingly great joy, because they are going to be able to get the answer to their quest. Essentially, they've traveled for months, if not longer, to arrive so close to where their objective is. And initially, it appears no one even knows what's going on. But the same stars that had initially given the information that this king had been born is now being used by God to help them to reach the end of their journey. All right, so verse 11, when they had come into the house, they saw the young child with Mary his mother, and fell down and worshipped him. And when they had opened their treasures, they presented gifts to him, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. How surprising and overwhelming it must have been to that home to receive such unusual guests in such unusual circumstances. And these princely gifts are not given a moment too soon, because this young family is within hours of becoming refugees in a foreign land for several months, if not years. And so heaven is providentially supplying the needs of this young king while he ends up in exile. There are 2 divine dreams that give them time to escape. Read with me in verse 12. Then, being divinely warned in a dream that they should not return to Herod, they departed for their own country another way. Now, when they had departed, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream, saying, arise, take the young child and his mother, flee to Egypt and stay there until I bring you word, for Herod will seek the young child to destroy him. And so these 2 divine dreams actually give a significant amount of lead time for Joseph to get his family, because rather than returning to Jerusalem and saying, we found the child here, as Herod was hoping and requesting, they just stayed in Bethlehem an undetermined amount of time. We're not even told in the text, And then they departed Bethlehem. And so, unfortunately, they're close. Bethlehem is close enough to Jerusalem, and these visitors were probably notable enough that it didn't take long for word to get back to Jerusalem that these noted visitors had left the country and were not returning to Jerusalem. And so it certainly was not a lot of lead time, but these two dreams together gave Joseph enough time to depart towards Egypt about the same time these visitors were departing for their homes another way. And of course, with these gifts that he's going to be able to use to provide for his family in Egypt. And so when the time is right, God can call his son out of Egypt, just as he did the nation of Israel many generations before. And so that is how Herod and his plot to destroy Jesus was thwarted. And yet, the wickedness of Herod is carried out. It's really sad that Herod's deadly enemy is an innocent young child. God's supernatural dreams of warning had robbed him of the opportunity of making a direct strike against Jesus. And so he casts a broad net, which he feels is sure to capture his prey. But in doing so, he is willing to sacrifice dozens or even hundreds of other innocent lives to make sure Jesus did not escape. And what did he say? Let me know where he is so I can come and worship him. The wise men from the east did come to truly worship him. And yet these notable individuals, Herod and the wise men, one group decides that Jesus is worthy of worship. The other decides that Jesus is worthy of destruction, so worthy of destruction that even when Herod can't be sure which of these young boys is the king of the Jews, he is determined to slaughter anyone who could be. That's a picture of pure evil. And let's read that playing out in verse 16 and following. It says, Then Herod, when he saw that he was deceived by the wise man, was exceedingly angry, and sent forth and put to death all the male children who were in Bethlehem and in all its districts from 2 years old and under, according to the time which he had determined from the wise men. Then was fulfilled what was spoken by Jeremiah the prophet, saying, A voice was heard in Ramah, lamentation, weeping, and great mourning, Rachel weeping for her children, refusing to be comforted because they are no more. The great conflict between the Messiah and evil has hardly begun, and it is already deadly serious. Well, it's not long before this cruel and murderous king dies. But first, he's afflicted with a severe, prolonged, painful illness that is so unusual and debilitating that, as Josephus, the historian, observed, it's clearly, quote, God's judgment upon him for his sins. 1 Timothy 5, verse 24 says, Some men's sins are clearly evident, preceding them to judgment, but those of some men follow later. Herod knew that his cruelty and injustice had made him hated by his subjects, and the thought of them rejoicing at his imminent death was so disgusting to him that he made a plan to make sure that his passing would be mourned. He collected the most beloved residents of the Jewish nation at that time and kept them confined until the day of his death, upon which time he ordered them to be killed. So just think about that. So that the whole nation would be mourning the death of this hated king because it brought about the death of the many of their most beloved public figures. Just a pretty despicable act again. Well, In Matthew chapter 2, verse 19, the Bible account picks up. Now when Herod was dead, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt, saying, Arise, take the young child and his mother, and go to the land of Israel, for those who sought the young child's life are dead. Then he arose, took the young child and his mother, and came into the land of Israel. It appears that Joseph's original intention upon returning to his homeland was to raise Jesus in Bethlehem, where Jesus was born. It was also the ancestral hometown of David, the king. And so there could hardly be a town with a more significant reputation. And of course, that is where Jesus was born. But verse 22 tells us, when he heard that Archelaus was reigning over Judea instead of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. And being warned by God in a dream, he turned aside to the region of Galilee. And he came and dwelt in a city called Nazareth, that he might be fulfilled, which was spoken by the prophets. He shall be called a Nazarene. And so the Herod's successor, Archelaus, did not have a good reputation. Rome eventually banished him from power because of his exercise of cruelty in his reign. And so another divine dream results in the Messiah's family settling in Nazareth. And there couldn't be a greater contrast between Nazareth and Bethlehem as far as its reputation, but at least it was outside the immediate influence and control of Archelaus. Herod had been, his reign had been embarrassing enough to Rome that upon his death they divided his rule into several portions. And so Archelaus was ruling over Judea, and others of Herod's descendants or sons were ruling over Galilee. Well, as we said, Jesus becomes, his adopted hometown becomes Nazareth. Of course, that was where Joseph had grown up. That was his hometown. And it was fitting for the one who was prophesied to be despised and rejected by men to be known as Jesus of Nazareth. Any Nazarene had an instant strike against him, as Nathanael, himself a Galilean, said in John chapter 1, verse 45, when Philip found Nathanael, he said to him, We found him of whom Moses in the law and also the prophets wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph. And what is Nathanael's response? Nathanael said to him, Can anything good come out of Nazareth? And Philip said to him, Come and see. And so you see kind of even here in the biblical text that this was a place with not a good reputation, kind of the worst reputation in that area. And Matthew claimed that Jesus being raised in Nazareth fulfilled what the prophets prophesied. There in chapter 2, verse 23, and it says that this happened, he dwelt in a city called Nazareth, that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken by the prophets, he shall be called a Nazarene. Now there is no direct statement to this effect in the prophets, he shall be called a Nazarene, but his disreputable hometown fulfilled the picture of the humble circumstances and status of the Messiah. For example, Zechariah 9, verse 9 tells us, Rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. Shout, O daughter of Jerusalem. Behold, your king is coming unto you. He is just and having salvation, lowly and riding on a donkey, a colt, the foal of the donkey. And Isaiah 53, verse 7 says, Because he was afflicted, he does not open his mouth. Like a sheep is led to the slaughter, and like a lamb is voiceless before the one who shears it, so he does not open his mouth. His judgment was taken away in humiliation. And who will describe his family? For his life was taken from the earth. He was led to death because of the lawless acts of my people. And so his disreputable hometown was part of the picture of his humble circumstances and the humiliation that he endured as the Messiah. But Jesus' early disciples also would see a connection between Nazarene and the Hebrew word branch, or netzer, which shares the same root. That word is found in Isaiah chapter 11 and verse 1, where Isaiah says, There shall come forth a rod from the stem of Jesse, and a branch shall grow out of his roots. And so the picture here is that that from the root of this tree that's been cut down, the mighty root or trunk of David, a small shoot or a lowly bush sprouts, using this word Nazar or Netzer, which is the same root as Nazareth. And so this is a prophecy of the Messiah being this branch or shoot. And they would also see similar language in passages concerning the Messiah in Jeremiah 23 and verse 5 and Zechariah 3 and verse 8. Jeremiah says, "Behold, the days are coming, says the Lord, that I will raise to David a branch of righteousness. A king shall reign and prosper and execute judgment and righteousness in the earth." And Zechariah 3 verse 8 says, "Hear, O Joshua the high priest, you and your companions who sit before you, for they are a wondrous sign. For behold, I am bringing forth my servant, the branch." Here the word for branch is different than in Isaiah 11, but this is the same type of branch terminology in the prophets. So although there is not one prophet in the Old Testament who said he will be called a Nazarene, rather his background of humbleness and humiliation was something that was even shared and illustrated by his adopted hometown of Nazareth. However, the Jewish enemies of Jesus and the church would link Jesus' hometown and being a Nazarene to a different Old Testament reference in Isaiah 49, where that same word is used, and they would argue that Jesus of Nazareth and his followers of the sect of the Nazarenes should be considered like an abominable branch that even the grave rejected, referring to the description of Lucifer in Isaiah chapter 14. And I'll read Isaiah 14, verse 18. Says, "All the kings of the nations, all of them sleep in glory, everyone in his own house, but you are cast out of your grave like an abominable branch, like the garment of those who are slain, thrust through with a sword, who go down to the stones of the pit like a corpse trodden underfoot." And so they would argue, here's one reason that we know that Jesus isn't the Messiah, because he comes from Nazareth, and he's like the branch mentioned here in Isaiah 14. That's an abominable branch that must be cast out. And we actually have a record in the Jewish Talmud of how they actually used this passage in judging some of the disciples of Jesus. And we know from Acts chapter 24, verse 5, that the Jewish enemies of the church associated Jesus' followers with the same despised location and sought to cast them out and kill them as well. They're accusing Paul, the apostle, and their representative says before the Roman authorities in Acts 24, verse 5, "We found this man a plague, a creator of dissension among all the Jews throughout the world, and a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes." So they're all Nazarenes according to the Jewish leaders. And so I'm going to give a quote from the Jewish Talmud, which was kind of a record of some of the oral traditions of the Jewish rabbis and elders that was eventually recorded. And so it says in the Sanhedrin section, Jesus the Nazarene had 5 disciples, Mattai, Nakai, Netzer, Bunai, and Toda. And so this is kind of giving an account of some disciples of Jesus that were brought in judgment before either the Sanhedrin or one of the other Jewish courts or council. And notice one of them is named Netzer. He just happens to have a name that is related to Nazareth and this Hebrew word that's translated branch in the Old Testament. And so each of these 5 disciples were brought in to stand trial and end up being condemned to execution. And I'll read now the section of Netzer facing that trial. Then they brought Netzer in to stand trial, and he said to the judges, "Shall Netzer be executed? But isn't it written, in a branch Netzer shall grow out of his roots," in Isaiah 11, verse 1? They said to him, "Yes, Netzer shall be executed, as it is written, but you are cast out of your grave like an abhorred branch," or Netzer, in Isaiah 14, verse 19. And so here we see kind of the early church is relating Jesus as a Nazarene to the good Old Testament prophecies about the branch. Those were prophecies about the Messiah, but some of the enemies of Jesus are relating the fact that Jesus was from Nazareth and his fathers are the Nazarene to this bad Old Testament prophecy relating to the word branch. Well, which is it? Was Jesus truly the Messiah and therefore the branch that sprung from the root of David? Or is he a abhorred branch that deserves to be cast out? That really was the question that Herod the Great answered emphatically by killing dozens of innocent children in Nazareth. And that is the question that the Jewish councils emphatically answered whenever they cast out and killed the Christians when they judged them to be blasphemers or heretics. But that's not the truth. The truth is that Jesus truly is the Messiah. The wise men were right to come and worship him. And we are right to do the same. But we have that choice to make. Will we worship Jesus and consider him worthy, or will we consider him worthy of death? Will we reject Jesus or share in the rejection he experienced at the hands of the world? If he truly is the King of the Jews and the Son of God, then there can be no shame to be a Nazarene like him, even to be hated, persecuted, or endangered by the most wicked. And so that's my exhortation to us as followers of Jesus this morning. Thanks for your attention.